Well, I certainly support Senator Golden's bill, but I've also got a number of other bills that I want to speak in support of, namely 5175 and 287 for the $10.50 minimum wage, the $15 minimum wage bill that Senator Culkin has sponsored, and I also want to oppose the youth, the 289. So several of the points that I would normally make have been made by others, and as has been noted, that's a great thing. I would like to clarify a couple of points that have been made, and also raise a couple of other things that haven't been raised that I think it's important that this committee be able to consider. First of all, I think it's really important that people recognize that fundamentally, every year in which we do not increase the minimum wage, we are effectively giving the lowest wage workers in Rhode Island a wage cut due to the effects of inflation. You have in your packets, or being distributed now at least, a chart that compares nominal minimum wage in Rhode Island with the inflation-adjusted minimum wage in Rhode Island. And what you see is that, yes, indeed, over the last few years, we have seen an increase, and that's definitely a good thing. If you look over the longer run, since the year 2000, we have seen a grand total of 97 cents, increase in the inflation-adjusted minimum wage for workers in Rhode Island. That averages out to something less than 6 cents an hour. And so it's really important that we keep those numbers in mind. When you hear something about a 43% increase, if that 43% increase, equates to an inflation-adjusted 20 cents or something like that an hour, then that's not particularly meaningful for folks, and certainly doesn't help them to make ends meet at the end of the day. So I think that's a really critical point to emphasize. The second thing I want to mention, Mr. Simmons mentioned that certain sectors would be hit particularly hard by an increase in the minimum wage. And what's really interesting is that he says that while also mentioning, again, repeatedly, the fact that we've increased the minimum wage in recent years. Well, the very sectors that he says would be hurt are the very same sectors that have been thriving over the last 3 or 4 years, really since the recession ended, and DLT data supports that. Those lower income, lower wage employment sectors also tend to be the ones where people go to when they have disposable income. Those fast food restaurants, those high turnover clothing stores, that's where low income folks go to when they have some disposable income in their pockets. And that's why increasing the minimum wage is the best thing that we can do to also create jobs. Consumers with disposable income are the real job creators in our economy. We have an economy that is hugely, disproportionately driven by consumption. So when you put money in the pockets of folks who desperately need goods, to put clothes on their kids, on their children, etc., that money gets spent. It gets spent locally. It helps drive our local economies as well. Important to consider. It's also important to look at what the research shows. And one of the really neat things about the fact that we have different minimum wages in several states is that for researchers, that sets up a perfect sort of experiment where we can compare and contrast across state lines what happens when you increase the minimum wage in one state, but we haven't increased it in another state. The very best research is being done at the University of Berkeley. Their Institute for Research on Labor and Economics shows very clearly that there is not a disemployment effect when we increase the minimum wage. We are not hurting lower wage workers. We are not hurting people of color. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Those are the folks that are benefiting the most from increases to the minimum wage. It's also important to emphasize that increasing the minimum wage is one piece of the puzzle, but increasing the earned income tax credit in complement to that is also a really important step that we can take here. Research out of the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts shows very clearly that those two things together have the greatest impact at lifting lower income folks out of poverty towards self-sufficiency. And so it's really important that we lock onto that as well. And then finally, I think if we're considering the possibility of having a bill that increases the minimum wage over time and then links it to some inflation factor, I would urge you to consider not linking to the CPI, but instead linking to average wage growth. those two series grow at slightly different rates. It doesn't make a big difference in 1 or 2 years, but over the longer term, tying it to that other inflation adjuster will make a big difference for lower income folks over time. And so those are my comments. If anyone has any questions.
Any questions for Doug? Senator Lombardi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug, I had followed out one of the other speakers, and she deferred to you on this question. I think you partially answer it in affected breadwinners who are minimum wage, affected workers who are breadwinners in the family.
Yep.
You've equated it at 64% of those people happen to be primary breadwinners for the family.
That's
Do you
right.
have any data on what that family income is? In other words, what does the other 36% earn?
So we know what the income breakdown is of folks that would benefit from the minimum wage, and I'd be happy to share that data with you. It's fairly, complicated, and it's on a spreadsheet that's got 25 rows. Certainly, what is true is that lower income folks very disproportionately benefit from the increase in the minimum wage. It's also true, though, that there are some folks, in higher income families, one person in the family might work at a minimum wage job, and so there are some folks at the higher end that also benefit, which is actually one of the reasons that the earned income tax credit is maybe even a preferable tool, because it more clearly targets lower income, working poor folks.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Connolly.
Doug, if we were to tie the minimum wage to an index going forward, and let's suggest that the average wage increase each year, any suggestions on how we determine what the correct base is before we start doing that, so that we start with a fair playing field before we start doing that?
Sure, yeah, and that's a really important point to make, and it was one that was made by I think the previous person that spoke. Locking in at a low level is going to perpetuate the misery for lower income folks. So certainly we want something that's as close to a living wage as possible. Personally, I think if we get to 15, that's probably getting to be in the right ballpark. Our Rhode Island Standard of Need that we do every 2 years shows that for an individual, for one person supporting themselves, they would need a minimum wage of about $12.38 an hour. For a family of 2, 3, 4, obviously they need significantly more than that. So, certainly anything that's not in that sort of, $12 to $16, $17 range, I think would be a mistake.